Well, welcome to ZeefCon. Welcome to the afternoon. You made it this far. How's everyone doing? Y'all enjoying the conference? Yeah. All right, so this is not as a technical talk as we've seen some talks be. That's fine, but I think what the implementation of this theory of what we're trying to get to will help better conduct adversary emulations, better conduct red teaming engagements, and better drive purple team's understanding about what adversaries are doing. So with that, who am I? I'm Chistopher Peacock. I started out as a help desk engineer and then moved into networking at Alpha 2. I finally moved on to a SOC Tier 3 role, or tier 2 role at General Dynamics. I also started doing purple team testing back before it was really called purple teaming. Back in the day, you always wanted to beat the pen testers to make your boss look good, so we actually started doing stuff like running Mimikatz and Kerberosin and things like that. And that started my drive of trying to understand what adversaries do and what it looks like in the environment, because growing up and learning information security, on the blue side, it was one of those things of antivirus catches malware, malware is bad, remove malware. And then we realized that really wasn't working because everyone kept getting popped. And I think that's quite evident by just ransomware and how prevalent it is across multiple industries. It shows that organizations from a defensive standpoint are nowhere near where they need to be, and also they haven't been learning how to actually prevent attacks from happening and preparing themselves for that. And that's why I think we're here in a Purple Team conference, is to help organizations have a better understanding of what's actually going on. So from General Dynamics and doing that SOC Tier 2 work, I went to Raytheon Intelligence, where I was at an MSSP, had multiple clients across multiple industries, and I worked everything from incident response there to SOC Tier 3 to threat hunting, incident responder, I think I already said that, and lead intelligence as well. So pretty much a jack of all trades there, and had my hat in many different areas. And then from there, I'm now at Scythe, where we do adversary emulation and detection engineering. And that's where I kind of went down this rabbit hole, and hopefully I can share some of the knowledge gained from the rabbit hole I went down and help you all better do emulation and purple team engagements. So one of the things with the intelligence timeline that we see, we really didn't have cyber threat intelligence for a while. And then we got the kill chain. And this is a great write-up if you ever get the chance. The kill chain is a great structure that you can start categorizing adversaries' actions into different steps of a kill chain, and you can start mapping that to defense. Well, with that as well, you can get into things like diamond modeling, and you can start tracking adversaries, and that's great, but it didn't really give us a lot of actions, so to speak, from the blue team side. It was more just a way to bucket what we did to say these rules are applicable for this area, or these rules are applicable for this area. So we had the kill chain. And some time went on, and then we finally had the APT1 report. And with the APT1 report, it was the first time that we actually started looking at adversaries, right? We started moving past antivirus. We actually saw that there's humans behind the operation. It's not just a worm that just spreads like I love you worm. And then finally we had the pyramid of pain, and we'll cover that a little bit later. Oh, by the way, how many people are red teamers by chance? How many people are blue teamers by chance? Okay, we actually have a good split. Okay, nice. Any purple teamers? Anyone on both sides? All right, all right. It's up and coming, you know, it's an up and coming field. And then, so from the pyramid of pain, I think a lot of blue teamers will be familiar with that. Red teamers might be something new. Then we get to MITRE ATT&CK, and that's kind of where everyone's at now. Everyone loves talking about MITRE ATT&CK and technique coverage. And we'll dive into that a little bit and where we're going. So with the APT1 report, one of the interesting things is we were actually focused on the human element. This is where we actually understand that there's organizations behind the actions taken. And this is important because when you think about organizations, it could be ransomware actors, they're an organization, crime groups. It could be an advanced persistent threat. It's an organization as well. With organizations, you have a lot of things that start getting repeated at the procedure level. And that's because they have tendencies. Even if it's just one person, if you did something the past 5 engagements as a red teamer, you're probably going to try that trick again on your next engagement. Within an organization too, they have certain approved tooling. If you're going up against an advanced persistent threat, it takes time for them to actually have tooling that gets approved to use in their environment. Similarly too, it takes time to get used to certain tooling. And that comes down to training. Maybe you have training in certain tooling. Maybe you have training in certain procedures. Maybe you go to a YouTube video and it says, you type this command in, you get this result. You take that result and you put it in here. So training is, again, and then manuals as well, such as the Conti manual, definitely a huge resource. You can see that people follow manuals. So what we're getting at here is that AV, I think most of us in this room know that AV hasn't cut it. If not, we wouldn't have a career because AV would work and it'd be left up to them and we'd be out of jobs. But there's humans behind it. In the APT1 report, it brought up that they have certain procedures that these humans run with the malware that they use. And the interesting thing here is, this was back in the early teens, 2014, I think, 2015, this was released. We see a bunch of net view, net group, net local group. We see all these procedures. But what we failed to do is actually make these actionable. We're not actually testing these procedures in organizations and helping blue teams and organizations defend against themselves. And I can show you this because when I go to the Conti playbook, these commands should look familiar because they were used in the APT1 report. So we had over, half a decade, and the same procedures are still operating on networks without getting caught. And it's because we failed to evolve as blue teamers to the procedures that the adversaries were using. So with that, we also go down to the pyramid of pain. Now, if you're not used to this, that's fine. We'll go over it briefly. There's a great write-up, though, by David Bianco. And he starts out with hash values. If you're a red teamer, I'm sure you probably generate a new hash every payload. And you probably put multiple payloads in an environment. So that way, when one hash gets caught, you're going to have other payloads that are available to you. So we don't really want to focus here from the defensive side. It's trivial for a threat actor to change the hash. Then we get to IP address. It's very trivial or easy for them to change that. Domain names, it's very easy to change that. You can do it with an algorithm. You have domain generated or algorithms that generate domain names. So that's very simple for threat actors to change. So we're really not focused on any of this from a perspective of defense. Now, we do pay IOC feeds to bring these into our environment and then check for, compliance reasons. If someone's known to be bad, we do want to check for that. But our focus shouldn't be here. We don't want to waste time for this. We can automate it, and we can do that validation check, so to speak. But we know a good adversary will just get around that. We get up to network and host artifacts and tooling. Now, this is where things start getting more challenging. But still at this point, most of the time we're relying on our vendors still to do this. So for network artifacts, we're starting to look at our IDS, IPS vendor to address those issues and track those. And then tooling, we're looking at our EDR and AV and things like Yara to do that. And at the top of David Bianco's pyramid, he put TTPs. Now this is one of the things that us in the industry, and I've been guilty of it myself, we throw around TTPs. We say the TTPs of the adversary. The TTPs did this, they did that. but we're just throwing it around. And with that, we aren't really getting down to granular levels of what each TTP stands for. And we'll break that out later. But for now, one of the things to highlight is with those atomic indicators that we were talking about before with the hashes, just to show why, if you're ever on an engagement from the red team side, or if you're on the blue team side and your boss is asking you to go after hashes, this is why it's not really worth the time. Because in 91% of the submissions that David Bianco reviewed, they were only submitted from one source. So this shows that when we have an IOC feed with hashes, most likely it's not going to add that much value to our organization. But they're worthwhile because they do check just to make sure. So that's one thing to highlight with those atomic indicators, as we call them. Then the other thing is, did I skip something? Sorry. All right, so then we get to attack. This was released the same, or 2 years after the AP21 report and the Pyramid of Pain. So we're still going through that timeline of what's gone on with cyber threat intelligence. And the thing is, with attack, one of the big things that we like to talk about is it's a one-way function. So one of the areas with this that we see right now is everyone's talking about techniques, techniques, techniques. And this is a great area to be in. It's better than the hashes and the IP addresses because now we're starting to understand those behaviors of the human behind the attack. But it's only a one-way function. So when we have those procedures and observations, we then map it to an attack technique. And that's why we have the sorting hat here, because he sorts the observations to a technique. But when we have a technique that's reported, we can't really map down to the procedure level. And this is kind of what the sorting hat looks like. So if I just gave you T1003, which is down here in credential dumping, you don't really know how an adversary dumped the credentials. So it doesn't go from technique down to procedure. But here we can see that the procedure maps to the technique. So we can see that proc dump was used. So now if I'm doing adversary emulation, I can go out and I can emulate this. Because the detection side will be different. If it's proc dump or mimikatz, it's going to be different. And then so that's where we get to the breakout. And we worked our way up. We've gotten to that technique level. And you're going to hear me say procedures a lot because that's where we're trying to get to. That's like the next level of cyber threat intelligence. Sticks and Taxi, they're not really pushing out procedures. Everything stops at the technique. And it's preventing us from getting to the actionable point of knowing if we have defenses against this procedure or not. So we'll start out first with the tactics, and that's at the lower level. In the tactics, they represent the why an adversary is doing a technique or sub-technique. It's pretty much the goal. So what does that mean for us, though, to make actionable? We actually don't have a lot of actions we can take from this yet. You know, we can see the techniques in there, so we can start prepping for that. But we can't actually do any sort of defense validation there. So at the end of the day, tactics exist to help categorize techniques into buckets. It makes the attack graph look a little nicer instead of just having a bunch of techniques. So from there, we then get to the technique level. This is a level that most of the threat intelligence right now is being communicated at. So, you know, we moved past those hashes and those IPs, and now thankfully a lot of intelligence reports are actually containing the technique IDs. But that's where it stops. So like once again, if we say that they dumped LSAS, okay, that's great. But I still don't know what that actually means. Once again, adversaries have tools. When an operator who is operating for a specific adversary, They have a tool. They might click one button to do one specific request. And then that tool is going to do that request for actions on objectives. Regardless of hash, it's still going to come out to a certain procedure. And that's where we don't know when we say this technique is being ran by this adversary, we still don't know how. And that leaves a gap in multiple areas of intelligence. For one, we can't necessarily do the tracking because you need procedures to help track, to see that procedure across different engagements from the adversary. From a defensive perspective, different procedures leave different artifacts behind. So one of the things is we see a lot of times with attack, everyone wants 100% attack coverage. It's an admirable goal, but I don't think it's actually doable, even though the report just came out from the last test and they said that all these EDRs had 100% attack coverage. So that's kind of the goal that a lot of people are after. And it kind of leads to this one area where I call it the checkbox fallacy. And what the blue teams are doing, they'll go in and they'll say, well, we have logs for this technique. But does it actually result in a response? Does it actually result in an alert? We don't know. So it's a checkbox fallacy. The other thing too that happens here with the attack matrix, you get a CISO comes in and he says, hey, I want coverage of attack. Well, what does that mean? Because there's a lot of techniques out there, so it's going to be very costly to actually go through all the techniques. And that's where CTI comes in, but we'll get into that a little bit later. The other area too is what procedure is used what procedures are most relevant to you, and that we don't always know. So what some people do is they'll do atomic test. They'll come in and they'll say, we need to test whatever this technique is, and someone will go out, they'll grab an atomic test, they'll run it, and then they'll do a blue check mark next to it. So that's another area that I call the checkbox fallacy for attack. I also have another thing that I use, and it's called procedure assumption. And like we said, here we have process discovery, and we map it down to atomic test. Now, one of the issues that we have is what happens if only one of these gets ran? Well, if only one is run, you can't say that that is coverage for T1057 because there's a lot of other ways to do 1057. So these are great, they're great starting points. If you're just getting started in a purple team engagement, or you're just starting out with blue team and trying to test a few things, doing the basic atomic test, that's a great area to start for coverage to see what your EDR is alerting on. Where do you have gaps, things like that. But you should never assume from a report that you read that it says process discovery, so it must be one of these procedures. So one of the areas is for this native API. That's not an atomic test. So what if the adversary is using that? Do you know if you actually have detections around that? Are the adversaries using that? That's where CTI gets involved, and you actually have to study and you have to do the procedures that the adversaries are leveraging to validate the detections and the response for the organization. One of the other areas that we also see is where they say, hey, I'm really worried about APT1. So then they go in and they grab the APT1 graph off of Attack Navigator. I love Attack Navigator, but for one, APT1 is outdated because they've probably merged into a different APT group by now. But also, once again, we have like local account discovery. How? How did they actually go out and do that? We don't know. So when you're asked to do a red team engagement, sure, you can grab a random procedure and you can run it to check that box. But are you actually doing what the adversary does or not? So that's one thing to think about when you're doing a red team engagement, is to wonder, how's the adversary doing it? Go out, see if you can find it, and actually replicate that for the customer. Finally, at the top of the new pyramid that I've expanded on are the procedures. So this is where we get to how they actually did it. In this example, it's proc dump. Was it mimikatz? There's a bunch of different ways to dump LSAS. There's a bunch of different ways to do pretty much all the techniques. You know, I think phishing with an attachment is a technique. You know, is it an Excel document with a macro? Is it an ISO with a link file in it? These things matter because at the end of the day, it's what we're going to use to validate detections against real world threats. And we need those procedures that the adversary is doing to do it. One of the things this looks like pretty much is that we have all these different techniques, but what we really want is the procedures over here. And it takes a little bit more work. If you're in cyber threat intelligence, you're going to actually have to read through and extract procedures. If you're trying to do adversary emulation from the red side, you're going to have to read through and try to get to procedure level. But we see a bunch of commands that adversaries do over and over again. And that's what we need to test. We need to test the way the adversary is actually operating at a procedure level. And what this helps us do is once again focus on that human element. So they have the training, the tools, they have approved actions. I don't know how many of y'all are in a large organization, but if you run an unapproved action, it's a very risky thing and you might not end up with a job anymore. So you have to think about these things, but we're getting down to the procedure level because those get repeated over and over again. When we read DEFA reports, by the way, shout out to the DEFAreport.com. When we go through different adversaries, they're using the same procedures over and over again. In fact, one point with a Conti playbook example, in one case, they observed the operator copy and pasting from the script, and they didn't even fill in the IP address. That's how much these things get repeated. Just like in a security operations center, there's SOC tier 1, right? And they handle most of the triage events. Well, a lot of times with red teams or advanced persistent threats, guess what? There's tier 1 operators who are doing much of the grunt work, just copying and pasting from things. So that's something we have to consider. So how do we leverage procedure level intelligence? Well, for one, we have to go out and extract it. And you just have to start identifying it. So in this example, Microsoft, they released a blog about a Chinese APT. And one of the ways that we can start thinking about, oh, what would this look like in our environment, is we can go in and we can see that MSHTA or MITRE. I'm not going to get into that argument here. I don't know if you've ever seen the argument on Twitter of if it's MSHTA or MITRE, but we can talk about that over drinks, cold beverages after the conference, which one it's pronounced as. But then we also see who am I being piped out to a .text file. So these are things that we can start wondering, all right, well, what would this look like in our environment? How rare is this? Can we do detections on it? We actually see the adversaries' actions on objectives. We see the procedures. So start thinking about how I can replicate this and then how I can use this in my environment to do my checks. Because once again, those hashes, those IPs, they don't really mean much to us because the adversary is always coming from a different location with a different hash. So we have to start looking at taking this intelligence, extracting it, replicating it, verifying detections, building detections, and then also verifying response. So outside of reports, I'll touch there real quick too. Shout out to George in the audience. George actually brought us a threat intel report that had a link inside of an ISO. So with that example, we went ahead and we replicated the procedures. Once again, this only maps really back to phishing with an attachment. But we got down to the procedure level. It was an ISO with a link. You click that link runs run DLL 32, and then that kicks off a malicious DLL. We saw the report. We went ahead, George performed it. I reviewed the logs, and then we're pushing new rules to Sigma. Just like that, within about a day, we're already catching a new delivery. And I think like 2 or 3 months later, like Gossi the dog, by the way, if you don't follow him and you're in any sort of intelligence type setup or blue team, I highly recommend following him. But it was like 2 or 3 months later, he's talking about this procedure getting used again. The other area that we can look at outside of reports and open source intelligence is our incidents. If we're on the inside, we actually have intelligence from our incidents. We can replicate that. A lot of times people don't go through and replay their incidents. You should do that, and you can start actually testing different procedures as the incident progressed to where it was, and you can start doing detections for each procedure along the way. So next time when that adversary comes in, I like to say that you have enough landmines around then that they'll step on one. You know, they're not going to repeat a whole string, but they might repeat one. So look at your incidents and start replaying each procedure and then triggering those alarms and build those alarms where necessary. The other area that we can do is we can set up honeypots. So if you're in CTI or if you're on the blue team, you can set up honeypots. Now, some people will be like, Chris, honeypots are terrible. And I'll be like, why? And they go, well, because a good hacker, once they get into a honeypot, they're going to know they're in a honeypot, and then they're going to leave it alone. Fair point, but they're going to give me some good procedures first. Let's say they have to exploit their way into a honeypot. Well, then I'm going to see something like Apache kick off another process like PowerShell, and then possibly call out to do a download. I'm going to see some actions there that I can start building detections on. I'm also going to see if I can take those procedures and replicate them in other areas such as production in my environment and see if that triggers a SOC response. The other thing is, let's say they've done the exploit. They've now done their initial chain. That's great. Typically, before they know they're in a honeypot, you're going to have to do a little bit of enumeration. So now I can flag on that enumeration as well. We can replicate those procedures again. So honeypots aren't useless. Do they give us the full attack chain? No. But it's way better to catch an adversary at the beginning of that attack chain, and we're catching those procedures there. And then the other area that we get to that we can also get procedure level intelligence from is sandboxing. One of the best areas that we can actually get sandboxing data from is email gateways, security email gateways. You can go in there and you can grab samples from the email gateway. You can run them in a sandbox. And then you can see the actions that occur from there. And if you leave it on long enough, sometimes you'll get some interactions from the adversary. Once again, they might know that they're in a sandbox eventually, but you still have those initial actions. And that way you can make sure that you're flagging on those in your environment. So sandboxing from your email gateway is a great area. And the other thing too is, you know, maybe the adversary is using macros right now to get in, and your email gateway is doing a great job at blocking that. Great. But what if they change that delivery? You know, it still might be a Cobalt Strike payload at after either's one's ingress. It still might be the same type of C2, but you're still going to get a few of those initial actions of the adversary potentially. So that's another area that we can gather cyber threat intelligence. And one of the ways that we see making procedure level intelligence actionable is we're going out, we're identifying the adversary. I can't talk about how to identify adversaries for each organization. There's a great talk or a great post by Andy Piazza, I believe, who talks about Threatbox. If you get a chance, it's on Medium. I recommend reading that. And you can start identifying adversaries. The other thing that you can do to identify adversaries is you can ask the organization, hey, what adversaries are you seeing on your email gateway? Because Microsoft, Proofpoint, pretty much all the email gateway vendors, they track adversaries and they'll actually tell you who's hitting you. So we start looking at that. We hypothesize who would our adversaries be or who's hitting us now, and then we can focus on gathering that threat intelligence around them, extract the TTPs, and once again, we're getting down to that procedure level. We want to know what their procedures are so that we can validate our detections around it. And then we'll analyze and organize it, create a plan, and then finally we'll do the red team or the adversary emulation side of it. So with that, we want to start with the emulation. With the emulation, we want to first test the known procedures. We do this just to make sure. I'm telling you, there's oftentimes, I'm sure any of you red teamers out here, you've heard it time and time again. Oh yeah, we'll catch that. The sad thing is oftentimes we don't catch that. So let's just start with the known procedures first if you're on the red team and you're trying to do emulation. From there though, once we're up to snuff on that, up to snuff is probably a saying that doesn't always translate well. Once we have coverage of the known procedures and we know that we have alerts firing and we know that the SOC is responding to it, then we want to adapt the procedures. So maybe we have ISO with link file, and the link file is kicking off run DLL32 to kick off a malicious DLL. Well, what else can you use to kick off the DLL? Let's start there. Let's start substituting other ways that the adversary might migrate to. And then we can further improve the detections around that. And then the other area that we want to talk about is hypothesizing and testing variations to break the detection. So as we do the original control verification of the procedures from the adversary, and then as we've adapted that, we get to the point where hopefully the blue team's starting to get detections around it, and they're starting to respond to it. Well, that's where we want to look at the red team for some help, hopefully in a purple team engagement, because we want to collaborate. That's where we want to say, here's the detection rule. Red teamers reach out to the detection engineers. Detection engineers reach out to the red team and tell them, hey, try to break my rule. We want to get to that next step. So that's where we also want to see red team emulations go from the procedure level and be adaptive. And this is a way that we operationalize purple team with procedure level intelligence. So we get the new procedures. From there, we take them, we emulate an attack. That's great. After you've emulated an attack, you have to work on detection engineering typically. So from there, we kick off the detection engineering cycle. And what we have there is the collection, which is going out and getting the logs. I don't know if you've ever actually had to go through and try to get logs. We were doing a purple team workshop class earlier, and one of the students was asking, he said, so not everything's in the SIM? And I'm like, no, not everything's in the SIM. It might be in the EDR because you don't want to pay to store process logs in both places. Or maybe certain firewall logs are sent to the SIM, but not all the logs. So we do the collection, and then we process that collection, and that's where we start doing detection engineering. And hopefully we disseminate it back as an alert to the SOC. So this is one of the areas and the ways that we see that we're operationalizing purple team. We get procedures, we test the procedures, what didn't get alerted on, let's build an alert. We have some more in-depth write-ups on this, and once again, that's a whole nother talk. One of the areas that you need to know, though, from a blue team perspective and a red team perspective, we said that attack and technique mapping is a one-way function. You can go up, but it's very difficult to come down. But with logging, we actually can get close enough. So from a blue team side, if a red teamer says they did this technique, this procedure, we can get close enough to do log verification. This is one of the important areas to know. So we run a procedure. We then map that to a technique. In this example, it's a technique 1059.001. And then, so if you go to the attack page for the technique that it's mapped to, you then can actually go down and see the data components. And then you can actually start going through and mapping each data component. And this helps with detection engineering. So that's one way too that we can also check these procedures and make sure that our procedure level intelligence is giving us actions. One of the actions is verifying that we have these data components that are given to us by MITRE. Like I said before, the other area that we can also map to are alerts. So in this example, we see alerts that were generated by a ransomware campaign. We have a lot of area that we have a lot of detection opportunities so that we can actually make detections. You can use an Excel sheet like this. You can implement it how you want in your environment. One of the other areas too that we see for detection engineering is that people get hyper-focused when we say procedures. I want to tell you, do not get hyper-focused. When I say procedure, I do not mean focus on every single little command in the command line, because you'll end up only catching a few events that are malicious. So make sure you don't do that. And like we said before, work with the red team to have them expand the detection where necessary. And then hopefully you can grow to where you're not just focused on one little area. Don't get too granular. Try to catch a broad set of malicious events for that rule. Also, by the way, embrace a certain amount of false positives because you're going to find some weird activity. The other area is monitoring and response. So when we get down to procedure level, this is where we can actually validate that we have monitoring and response for the adversary's procedures. But it takes understanding the threat landscape. So maybe we have our SOC train in a sandbox environment where we're running the procedures so that they can get used to seeing the procedures. And then we can eventually test that in production. So then when those procedures actually are in production, they're responding to it appropriately. One of the things is for the longest time, blue teamers, I feel like, didn't even know that PowerShell was being used maliciously. This is one of those examples, though, of where, you know, if they know PowerShell is being used, how it's being used maliciously, they respond better to alerts. So we need to practice, practice, practice. One of the areas, too, that we need to focus on is, I'll go ahead and skip one down, to verifying the response. So I've seen it before where an AV alert triggers, it says Mimikatz was detected on a domain controller. And SOC analyst goes in and they say, hey, that alert, it's okay. Mimikatz was detected, but AV cleaned it up. Case closed. If you don't know what Mimikatz is, it dumps the credentials. So this is a very bad response. What should happen is they should go, how the heck did this malicious application end up on a domain controller? And then they should start tracing back. So that's one of the things where we need to actually look at the response to each procedure to make sure that the response is appropriate. And then finally, don't focus on the technique level because it leads to too much confusion. Well, what are the procedures? And then finally, if you want to start taking procedure level intelligence, extracting it and using it in a meaningful way for your organization, we do have the Purple Team Exercise Framework. This is for free. George and some friends did a great job putting it together. I will say you don't have to use every specific thing in there. Just start doing some testing though. Start out with some atomic if you're not doing atomic. And then start looking at what adversaries are doing that matter to your organization and validate and build detections around those procedures. And that's really what we're trying to get to, is just making sure that when an adversary gets in, we can kick them out before impact. And as an industry, I don't think we've done a good enough job because ransomware has been so prevalent. It's impacting organizations across different industries and across different countries. And oftentimes they're still running the same procedures. So we really need to get down to that procedure level and help organizations build detections, tune their EDRs, and get after the adversaries out there. I know it might make some red team jobs harder, but I think that's what we're really about, is having a more secure world and having more secure industry and commerce across the world. So I hope that you go out and you study some procedure intelligence. I hope you actually start replicating different procedures that you're seeing in organizations. And like I said, happy procedure level purple teaming. I think that's the way of the future. I think that actually helps validate detections around our adversaries. And with that, I'll open it up to any questions.